Well, energy is all about power and how one uses power or the capacity to get a lot of work done. The master-slave metaphor is a metaphor that's pretty much defined almost all of our energy relationships. And it certainly defined the institution of slavery, and it even defines today our high-energy hydrocarbon culture. And it was Buckminster Fuller who first came up with this idea of energy slaves, writing in a business magazine, no less, in Fortune, in 1940, and saying, you know what, something has dramatically changed in the United States. In 1810, there were 1 million families and on an average of 1 million slaves, so 1 slave per family. And he said, but today in the United States, thanks to hydrocarbons, as feedstock for machines, the average American had at his beck and call as many as 30 slaves. And he said this was a profound change. He called them energy slaves and also inanimate slaves. And he said, you know, one of the reasons that the United States was such an exceptional place was because it actually contained billions of energy slaves, thanks to cheap oil. And so we're still in this culture. This culture has probably peaked. It has become ever more complex. And the average North American now has at their beck and call approximately 89 slaves, energy slaves, powered by oil. So that's not accounting for electrical slaves or nuclear slaves or a lot of the digital slaves fed by batteries that are now serving us and trying to make us comfortable, if not dumb and stupid.
Well, so let's talk about one of these institutions that has benefited from slavery. And so right now we're sitting in Laurier University. You argue that the universities have greatly benefited from oil and also serve to perpetuate the worldview and these structures in society.
Well, very much so. I mean, it's just not the energy that you got to think about. You've got to think about surplus energy. And civilization and culture is all about what you do with that surplus. So for high energy oil-based cultures, we've used a lot of that surplus energy. We've put it into science. We've put it into universities and education. And in many cases we've done that because the more energy slaves you employ, the more science you need to manage them, the more education you need to have in order to order and manage the energy slaves in your own life. And this all happens in so quickly and so subtly in many ways that we don't recognize what we've created these institutions for and how we have used the surplus energy associated with cheap oil. And we've spent a lot of that surplus energy. And as oil becomes more and more expensive, we're going to see a contraction of many of these institutions that the surplus created, allowed us to create. We'll probably see government get smaller, we'll see universities get smaller, we're going to see scientific institutions get smaller. We're going to see contraction right across the board.
And what do you think, what role should universities be playing as this dynamic unfolds? And do you think they're currently playing a positive role in this regard, or should they start changing course?
Well, what's happened to universities is that they used to be part of communities, and there used to be an idea that you were there to serve the broader community and to spark conversations and debate about important stuff going on in that community. As universities become more mechanized, as they become more industrialized, they've also become more corporate. They seem to be serving fewer and fewer people and institutions. They've often divorced themselves from the community. And they are not places that really inspire or encourage either constructive criticism or a really good social debate. They're divorced really from so much of ordinary life. So in many cases, unfortunately, I think universities are more part of the problem than they are part of the solution.
You start the book with the moral fable of Prometheus,
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of authors have talked about technological Prometheanism and this almost fetish about technology and how it will save the day. And in this book, you do not display any of this Prometheanism views, but rather debunk a lot of the potential for technology, whether it's biodiesel from algae, or the creative class found in large cities. But are there technologies out there that you feel do show great potential?
Well, that's a good question. Let me first kind of, so much of what we define as technology are essentially machines or gadgets that cheap energy have allowed us to create. And there was a really interesting American sociologist by the name Fred Cotterill, who kind of came up with a new definition for capitalism in the 1950s, and he wrote a really important book on energy, and he said, really, capitalism is really a system and form of production that creates more gadgets, more machines, higher forms of technology, but that all predicated on having cheap supplies of energy to feed all these things. And so we've sort of assumed that technology, that another gadget and another machine will come along and be able to do our thinking for us, or our work for us, or our farming for us, our city building for us, whatever. And I think we've peaked in that area as well. If you look at certainly the science or data in terms of patents, innovations, even scientific papers. So I don't see any technologies out there that are going to save us. Any new technologies, I see a lot of old technologies that we might find very, very useful. Something even as old as a horse pulling a cart is actually an incredibly efficient way for delivering certain kinds of goods. So, I think smaller scale, less complicated forms of technology that actually consume less energy is where we should be. That's what we should be focusing on, as opposed to ever flashier and noisier gadgets that consume more and more energy. I mean, most people don't realize today that when you pick up an iPod or you pick up a computer, the thing is embedded in oil, has taken extraordinary amounts of energy to make the chips that power those machines. And without oil, you wouldn't be using either one of them. And in many cases, but we are now producing gadgets, though, that are there just almost solely to distract us and entertain us. They're not adding any real value to our life.
Because a lot of the dynamics that you describe in the book, such as what happens with petrostates over time, or even with individuals as their values change, as they start to have access to more energy surplus, it almost feels as if there are just these large forces and there's nothing we can do about it. And so perhaps I was wondering, what are your views? How much of this is just determined? How many of this is just cycles that we have to live through? Versus how much can we change?
We always have the ability to change. I mean, that's what makes us human. And that's what makes us distinct in some ways. But when we live in a culture or a civilization where there's a kind of a dominant mode of energy production, there isn't a lot of room to maneuver there. So that if you lived in the 18th century and you lived in the southern United States and you lived in a plantation economy where owning a slave was pretty normal, there's a reason why there weren't a lot of abolitionists in the southern United States, right? Because it was very difficult for anyone in the U.S. South to conceive of a life or an existence where shackled labor wasn't performing work for you and making money for you. And the idea was, if anyone even raised the idea of emancipation, it was, well, wait a moment, I mean, if you drink tea and you put sugar in your tea, then that was raised by a slave. If you've got wearing cotton, then that too was picked by a slave. If you smoke tobacco, well, that was also harvested and picked by a slave. So how can you even question such a system? And we've reached the same point today, where oil so dominates what we do and how we do it. I mean, you can't get anywhere without a car or without a plane. We've kind of, given up on trains. We've given up on horses. You can find bicycles here and there, but your choices are limited, and so you have to deal with the fact that you are caught in a system where the powers that be have made certain decisions about how you're going to live. We're kind of locked in, and it's very hard to unlock that, and it usually takes a crisis to do it, and that's only when things start to change and transitions begin, and and usually a fair amount of conflict is involved in all of that as well. When you have a certain form, a certain energy system that kind of governs the day, whether it was slavery in ancient Rome or whether it's oil today in modern North America, those systems were not given up without a fight. The Romans didn't one day wake up and say, "My God, this is a pretty brutal system we have where, we send our army off and capture all this surplus energy, shackle it, bring it back, and wear these people out in 20 years and go out and do the same thing again and bring back more energy." We're not going to have that kind of epiphany with oil either. So it'll be a series of crises brought up, usually economic, brought about by the rising cost and the extreme nature of hydrocarbons that will force kind of unpredictable and uncertain changes.
Hopefully peaceful.
No guarantee that it'll be peaceful.
Okay.
It wasn't peaceful going up the energy ladder. I doubt it's going to be very peaceful going down it.
One of the countries which you do mention, though, as perhaps being a microcosm for the future is Japan, and how it was once I don't know if it was the second or third largest economy. Now it's suffering an economic, demographic, and an energy
malaise.
crisis almost.
Yeah.
Malaise, yeah.
I mean, if you want to have a picture of what the future might be, you have to look at Japan.
And it was very poetic how you say entropy has set in. I love that expression, and I've never seen it before, but at least not in that context. But the tone of the chapter, to me, it didn't really reveal your feelings towards Japan. Is this an exciting new story? Is this a terrible decline? Is this we don't know, and we'll only find out after the fact?
I think it's a cautionary parable. I think that Japan, when it married it's kind of this very aggressive militaristic culture in some ways with oil after World War II, and the Japanese then used oil the way they wanted to use it during World War II, which was to go out and let's expand and conquer most of Asia. But because that project failed, they now used oil to basically re-engineer the Japanese landscape with pretty disastrous consequences in terms of how they industrialized everything and standardized everything and concentrated populations and basically created this odd economic empire that's entirely dependent on the availability of cheap oil to deliver goods to its shores, which would then be remanufactured, reassembled, and then sent off to the United States. Nothing sustainable about it, nothing beautiful about it. And then when the oil crisis arrived in the 1970s, the Japanese, panicked, reconsidered what they were doing, and thought the solution was to go further up the energy ladder with nuclear power. We now know that was also a tragic path. And so now the Japanese are really having an enormous soul-searching about their future as both a people, as an island, as a geography, as an economy, um, um, and very clearly that is a culture that has enjoyed its day with oil and has now peaked. And they're beginning to realize that they have spent enormous amounts of energy without thinking at all about the future.
You end your last chapter, the epilogue, with a discussion of the Benedictine monks, and it starts so positively, but then even them over time, it seems, became corrupted by the wealth and power that came from their surplus, and to that extent, the book ends not necessarily on a positive note, but on a cautionary positive note, I would wonder. And I'm just wondering, what gives you hope about the future, and what do you tell your sons?
I tell my sons to use their energy wisely, and I be careful what you spend your time on. Be judicious about who your friends are. Keep your feet planted on the ground. I also tell them, look, recognize that the life that you have grown up knowing and experiencing, which is a pretty high energy culture, is going to go through some pretty fundamental changes. So I said, look, guys, you've got to be prepared for some unpredictable and uncertain events that are going to happen. And I'm hopeful. I tell the story about the Benedictine monks because it's almost a cautionary tale for Greens, because I think a lot of Greens think, okay, we know all the problems with oil, let's just get on with it and get on to renewable. Wait a minute, guys, you're still going to have some problems there. Every form of energy comes with its own limits, with its own form of sacrifice, with its own power monopolies, with its own elite class of folks, and you need to address this more important and moral issue of how much energy are we entitled to, and what do we actually use it for? And if we don't deal with those issues, then we're going to make all the same mistakes with renewables that we've already made with hydrocarbons, and we're not going to go anywhere, and we won't even know how to equitably and judiciously have any conversation about what do we do with the surplus if there's some surplus. Where should it be invested? So it's a cautionary tale.